We are now doing the third lecture on the first module, review of basic structural analysis. If you recall, in the last session we covered a bit about statically determinate structures. I think we were looking at beams, we stopped with the conjugate beam method. In this session I hope to finish that topic so that we can do work in energy methods in lecture 4. So just to remind you, the book we are following is structural analysis, and you need to refer to the book to look at the problems and the solved examples. So we were looking at the conjugate beam method, and here you see how it can be applied to solving fixed beams. This is a fixed beam AB with arbitrary loading, gravity loading. You can release the fixity, and so you get a statically determinate structure which is a simply supported beam, which you can divide into two parts, as you can see there, one where you have the loading and the other where you apply the fixed end moments, which are hogging moments, MFAB and MFBA at the two ends. And you can now look at the conjugate beam, which will be now free because the original beam is fixed, and you will find that on the top you will be putting the curvature diagram caused by the negative moments, so that is a straight line, and at the bottom you will have the free moment diagram m naught x by EI, and these two must self equilibrate. So you will find that the resultant force must be equal and the lines of action also must be equal. And what is interesting here is that if you equate the two areas, you will find that the bottom area is integral 0 to L m naught x dx by EI, and there are some advantages you get when the loading is symmetric. So let us look at those special cases where you have symmetric loading. I show you here two pictures of symmetric loading. The first is a standard concentrated load W acting at midspan, and the second is a uniformly distributed load of total magnitude W acting at the midspan. The support reactions are W by 2, and the two fixed end moments at the ends will be actually equal and opposite to each other. So we can call it just MF instead of MFAB and MFBA. So if you were to draw the conjugate beams, you will find that finding the fixed end moment is quite easy. The area on the top is, area of that diagram is MFL divided by EI, and that must be equal to the area of the free moment diagram divided by EI. So if you equate the two, you have this interesting equation which suggests that the fixed end moment is nothing but the average value of the free moment diagram, because 1 by L integral m naught dx actually means that it is an average value, and so it is easy to calculate. If you take the first case, you can, it is a triangle, so the area is easy to calculate. The second case, it is a parabola, so the area is 2/3 of the equivalent rectangle, and you can easily find the answers. The answers are, in the first case, WL by 8, MF is equal to WL by 8, and the second case it is WL by 12. So you will find that for symmetric loading it is extremely easy to do. It will take you just about a minute or so to crack the problem, and so the conjugate beam method is a very useful method to find fixed end moments when the loading is symmetric. When it is not symmetric, then you need two equations. This is another example, a little more work, but you will still get the results. Here you see that if you have a load P acting not in the middle, then you will have two moments which will be not equal to each other. The larger moment will be always nearer to the load. So in this case, if A is less than B, MFAB will be numerically more than MFBA, you have to equate the area of now a trapezium with that of a triangle, and you have to find their lines of action. This can be done. We won't go through this, but these are formulas that you need to recall, especially when you do displacement method. The fixed end moment formula here turns out to be PAB squared by L squared for the moment MFAB, and PA squared B by L squared for the moment MFBA. The previous case where you had a concentrated load in the midspan is obviously a special case of this, when A is equal to B is equal to L by 2. The conjugate beam method can also be used to find fixed end moments in propped cantilever beams. Here you have only one unknown fixed end moment, and here is a convention we will consistently follow. You will find that we are using not MFAB here, but we are putting a small knot there, MF naught AB, to remind ourselves that the far end B is a hinge, that small round that you see there is a reminder, and this also can be done in exactly the same way. Here you will find that the conjugate beam is not free, it is free hinged, and so the support reaction in the conjugate beam will take some reaction, and that reaction will be equal to the slope of the beam at B. Again you equate the forces and you can get the solutions. In this case it works out to be Q naught L squared by 8 for a uniformly distributed loading. Okay, so you can draw the shear force diagram, the bending moment diagram, once you get the fixed end moment, because once you got the fixed end moment, the beam is now statically determinate, and you know how to draw shear force and bending moment diagrams. For a statically determinate beam, the maximum bending moment will be where the shear force changes sign. You are quite familiar with all this. So we are done with the topic of beams. We looked at how to draw shear force and bending moment diagrams. We also did some interesting cases where a bending moment diagram was given to you and you had to figure out what loading caused that bending moment. We also looked at how to calculate deflections and slopes using direct equilibrium method. We now quickly move on to the topic of trusses. The basic assumption made in trusses is that the axial forces are the only forces that act in the various members. The bending moments and shear forces are assumed to be negligible. This is valid if we assume ideal pinned joints at the junctions of various bars, and if the loads are applied exactly at the joints. Now we know that the first assumption is strictly not true, because you need to have just one rivet or one pin for free relative movement between the members, but in practice you have more than one bolt. In trusses, in bridge trusses, you may have about 30-40 bolts in a junction, and if the elements are welded, then it is actually a rigid jointed connection, but that makes a truss highly statically indeterminate. And even if you were to do a very rigorous analysis, you will find that the departure from the assumption of ideal pin joints is not very significant. You get moments, but they are called secondary moments, and for a first order analysis we can normally ignore them. In design practice, if it is a heavy bridge truss, we try to account for it indirectly by assuming a 10% increase in the stresses. So please note, the whole idea of doing first order structural analysis is to get quick results which are reasonably accurate. And you are familiar with this. There is a conventional method of joints, and there is a tension coefficient method, which is a generalized method of joints, which can handle any type of statically determinate truss with any loading. Then you have the method of sections, which should be intelligently applied to save time. Here is an example of a 2-bar truss. You can see that the calculations are very easy to work out. We need to take advantage of the fact that there is an internal hinge at B, there is no bending moment transferred from one member to the other. You have only axial forces in the two members, and they are very easy to compute. So let us move ahead. once you have the axial force in the two bars, then you also have the axial deformations, because we know that there is a relationship between axial force and axial deformation. We use the word elongation to refer to the axial deformation. The word elongation is strictly appropriate if the axial force is tensile, which is what we assume when the force is positive. If the force is negative, then it is compressive and the elongation turns out to be a contraction. And what is the relationship between the axial force and the elongation? Elongation is equal to what?
PL by EL.
PL by EL. So the elongation in the ith bar will be equal to the axial force in the that bar divided by the length and the axial rigidity of that bar. So this follows directly from Hooke's law. So we can do that, and once you have got the bar elongation, actually you can locate the displaced position of the joint P. You can do it geometrically. I have shown a picture here where AB has reduced in length and BC has reduced in length, but if they were to be the way it is shown in this picture, then they do not meet, but we need to make them join. So the only way to do that is to rotate AB about A and CB about B till they meet, and you can draw arcs or tangents to do that, and that is how you locate geometrically, that is how you construct, and you can find, you can actually get the deflections, but we will find there are better ways of finding deflections. Trusses are commonly used in roofs, they are also used commonly in bridges. Bridge trusses are referred to either as through type trusses when the deck is below and the traffic goes, where you can see the two trusses on either side of your carriageway, or they are called deck trusses when the truss is below the deck, and there are other intermediate types called semi through and so on. Now we first studied beams and then we looked at trusses, so it is good to see an equivalence between the truss and the beam. Here I have shown two pictures of what are called as N trusses, because they look like the letter N, one of them does and the other is a mirror image. Let me ask you a question, for the loading shown here, which of the two is better, which is more structurally efficient, the top one or the lower one?
Lower top one is more efficient.
What is the, can one of you raise your hands, I will ask you to which one?
So the lower
No,
one.
let him answer. The top one, why do you say the top?
The members take tension.
Which members?
The truss members
Okay,
take
let us talk about the top chord in both the members. Don't they both take roughly the same order of axial compression?
It's a bottom.
What is so special about the bottom one?
When you cut the beam at any place,
Right,
the reaction at the left side support is upward.
right,
So the shear acting where you cut will be downward.
downward, so,
The member there, as it is aligned downward,
right,
it will be having a tension.
right. So the second, in the second truss, the diagonal members will be in tension, and the first truss, the diagonal members will be in compression. That you get from the equivalence with the beam when you do method of section. So we should prefer the bars going into tension. Why?
Tension.
That's right, because then you have problems associated with buckling, the size of the member has to be larger and so on. So these are important points to note. So the only difference between the two is the diagonals, the alignment of the diagonals. So you see overall the truss deflects like a beam, okay, and if you can, if your right brain is very good, you can actually see the contraction taking place in the top diagonals and the elongation taking place in the bottom diagonals. This is an equivalent beam, and you will find that the method of section essentially establishes a relationship between the axial forces in the various truss members with the bending moment and shear force values in the equivalent B over the same span. So, so if you cut a section here, for example, if you take moments about the point B, you can find out the actual force in the top chord in the second truss and the bottom chord in the first truss is given by that bending moment at that location 3, where B is divided by the height of the truss. So this is a quick way, and those are the maximum values of forces in that truss. If you had to design a truss quickly, you can do it very fast. Find out the equivalent bending moment in a beam, divide by the height. So this is a quick way of doing it, and you will find that there is this is how you can work through the different axial forces in the top chord and bottom chord. The axial forces will be maximum in the middle, just like the bending moment is maximum in the middle region, and it slowly dies down, and sometimes your end members will carry 0 force. You see that picture where the rectangle becomes a rhombus, one of the diagonals increases in length and the other diagonals decreases in length. So that gives you a visible idea of why one diagonal goes into compression and the other goes into tension, right, and you can calculate those shear forces. The other simple thing that you can take advantage of is the fact that whenever you have two sets of lines, they need not be orthogonal, they could be inclined, and they align the way it is shown here, then the forces must be equal and opposite in any one line. So for example, I have shown you 4 pictures there. Each of those lines could be a bar. So if it is a bar, then you are talking about an axial force in that bar. So you can take advantage of these pictures. If you look at the picture D, you will find that if say one of those bars has a 0 force, sorry, if you do not have an opposing force at that joint, then you can take that force to be 0. So you must develop the skill of identifying which are the 0 forces in a truss by inspection, and also the ability to identify whether the force that you get is tension or compression. So there are many problems. We will quickly see some examples. Here is a truss which looks little complicated because you have a large number of members. You can do a quick check and you find that m plus r is equal to 2j, so it is a simple truss, but you do not know where to start because there are so many forces, but perhaps some of them are 0 and you need some skill to figure out which are. We have done this problem earlier, so I will go through it quickly. So the first thing to recognize is if your load is P acting downwards, those are your reactions, and the reactions are statically determinate, they all turn out to be P. Then if you cut a section, say where I have shown, and you blow up that part, you will find, what can you make out from this picture, from this section? N3 is equal to P, and that follows from the fact that if you take moments about G, you can prove N3 is equal to P, and then once you go, once N3 is P and you go to the joint T, you will find that necessarily there are many forces which are 0, and you will find that actually you can remove those bars once they are 0 and your truss reduces to this problem. Okay, so it is a much simpler truss to analyze, and this can be done easily. You can analyze it by method of joints, triangular forces, easy. This problem again is an extremely interesting problem. This actually was posed by Timoshenko in his book on structural analysis, and the normal way of cutting sections does not work here. You will find wherever you cut a section you have far too many unknowns. You know that when you deal with a plain truss, you can at the most have 3 unknowns when you cut a section, and if you are doing method of joints, you can have at the most 2 unknowns. You will find that traditional techniques do not work. So here is a clever way of doing it. This is again a compound truss but statically determinate. What you can do is view that segment as a triangle and separate out that triangle, which means using a pair of mental scissors and snipping through those connecting bars, you expose those bars, and here you have one look at this picture and you know that there are only 3 unknown forces, you have 3 equations of equilibrium available, you can solve for it. Or you could take the other triangle and you could solve for it, and once you've got the idea, it's easy to calculate because you can use any 3 equations and solve it. Finally, the robust method of cracking any problem is a tension coefficient method, which means you take any joint. This is especially useful when you do space trusses. You write the coordinates of those joints and you define the tension coefficient as the actual force in any bar divided by the length of the bar, and you can write a generalized equation of equilibrium along the x direction, along the y direction, and along the z direction. And so you can systematically write these equations moving from joint to joint and solve them. This is a generalized way of doing it. This is the way you would probably do if you had to use a computer to solve the problem, because you do not take any shortcuts, you just go through it and solve a series of simultaneous equations, and you can make use of the direction cosines L, M and N for each bar. There is a systematic way of doing it. We are done with trusses for the time being. We move on to the next topic, and this is a good interface. Look at this problem which we looked at earlier. You have a pin joint at B, and what happens if you make that joint rigid? Strictly, what all can happen? You got axial forces in the first case. Now what is the extra that you can get? You can get bending moment, because now the joint at B is rigid, which means you have a moment resisting joint, right? Now if you get a moment, then the question I wish to ask you is, well, your vertical reactions do not change, your horizontal reaction is your unknown. If you get a moment at B, is that moment going to be sagging or hogging? I have shown here sagging. Will this work? No. Why won't it work?
90 degrees will be.
No, that is not the reason. Why won't sagging moment work? Now to really understand this, try to visualize it, visualize this by looking at the deflected shape, the possible deflected shape. Now please note, we normally assume that when you deal with frames, this is a frame, it is not a truss anymore, we make the assumption that axial deformations are negligible, right. So B does not really move down. B will move down only if the 2 bars will reduce in length. So you will have difficulty in drawing the deflected shape, because if you draw a deflected shape like this, you have to preserve the angle at B between the 2 bars, because it is a rigid joint. If it were a hinge joint, you do not have to worry about that compatibility requirement. So you will find that always if one of the elements is shown sagging, the other will be hogging, but your arrows will not satisfy that. So either you have to draw it like this, or you have to draw it like this, which means you will never get both sagging or both hogging. The deflected shape will not look like that. So you should know intuitively that something is wrong here. So what is the conclusion that you draw from this little so though the rigid joint has the potential to transmit a bending moment across the joint, in this particular instance that bending moment cannot be transferred, it just will not work out, the bending moment is actually going to be 0. So it is like saying you have a savings bank account, and that bank account can take in any amount of cash value, but being a student, very often it turns out to be 0. So it just shows there is a capacity, but you need not have any value to that. So in this case you do not have that. There is another reason for this. Can you tell me why is there no bending moment? Why are there? Perfect. This shape is funicular for that particular loading. This shape is funicular for that particular loading. And how do you recognize it's a funicular shape?
The beam and the concentrated load is acting at that point. The bending moment diagram is exactly.
Perfect. If you were to assume that there is a beam spanning across the supports A and C, a simply supported beam, and if you were to draw a bending moment diagram, and if the shape of the frame that you erect between those supports resembles to some scale that bending moment diagram, then you will get only axial forces in that structure. That is called the funicular configuration. So often we miss this out, because once you recognize the configuration funicular, it is ideal. The word funicular comes from the word funicle, which means a string, and that is the ideal shape. So you will find that this shape is funicular. In this instance, AB and BC will have only axial compression. If you flip it over, it is like a cable, it will have only axial tension. What is the main difference between an arch and a cable?
Compression.
Yeah. Who was answering for me? Yeah.
Arch takes compression and cable has tension.
Right. That's a, but there's some more difference between an arch and a cable. In addition to compression,
The moment is always zero.
okay. You see, a cable by definition is very flexible. Okay. An arch is rigid, is it not? It doesn't move around, and by virtue of its rigidity, it is capable of resisting, in addition to axial compression, bending moment and shear force, right. A cable just doesn't have that ability. So a cable will always assume a funicular shape for a given loading, but an arch is something that you make, at the most you can make it funicular for one loading, but when some other loads act on that arch, it will be non-funicular. There will be bending moments and shear forces in addition to the axial forces. This is important to understand. So to fully understand that bending moment relationship, look at that boulder on top. It's simply supported, there is no horizontal reaction, and look at a frame which is also simply supported. In both instances, the distribution of bending moment along the x axis will resemble that triangle if you have a concentrated load. Now if you are able to generate a horizontal reaction at the two supports, then that has a tremendously beneficial effect, because at any section you get a hogging moment, which is that horizontal reaction times the height y, and your net moment at any section is now reduced, this free moment or the sagging moment m naught x minus the hogging moment h into y. Now a funicular shape is one where m naught is equal to h into y, okay, or rather you can say y is equal to m naught by h, and if so, h is a constant, so it clearly follows that if the shape of y, the ordinate of your frame at any location, resembles your bending moment diagram, then you have got a funicular shape. So it is very easy to appreciate this point. So here is something on cables. Cables are very interesting to analyze. Again, you can compare with a simply supported beam, you get shear forces in the beam, you get bending moments in the cable. The cable will be made up of a series of straight lines if the loads acting are series of concentrated loads. The vertical reactions are very easy to calculate, as you would in a simply supported beam. Let us say the total load is W and it is located at a distance A from the left end and B from the right end, then VA and VB are very easy to calculate, and the horizontal reaction is actually obtained by the bending moment, the free moment in the equivalent beam, divided by the height at that location, right. So you can work out the heights at different locations once you know the bending moment. So all you need is the height at any one location, and usually you know the height at the maximum dip of the cable, and that height is called sag. Here I have shown HC, and so you can you can get the horizontal reaction. Now if a cable is inclined as shown there, then the axial force in that cable is related to the shear force in the beam as well as the horizontal force at the two ends, right. Now if you cut a section anywhere, you will find that the horizontal component is constant, and sometimes it is referred to as a horizontal tension in a cable, and in an arch it is referred to as a horizontal thrust. And so you will find that it's H is constant for all cables, for all segments, V is changing depending on the shear force, and the axial force is the resultant of H and V as shown there. So if the supports are at two different levels, then you can relate it to the first case. You will find that if the arrangement of loads is the same, the horizontal force does not change. We can prove this. It is the vertical force that changes. You get now a couple, the two H's are separated by a level difference, and that is self equilibrated by a reduction and an increase in the vertical forces. So this can be proved. Okay, we will move ahead. So the difference between the first case where the two supports were at the same elevation and the second case where the two supports are at different elevations is only in the vertical reactions. The horizontal force is the same, VA increases to some extent and VB reduces. If the cable is subjected to distributed loads, then it is not going to be made up of straight lines, it will be curved, and you can actually generate an equation which relates the geometry of the cable to the forces in the cable. If you take vertical equilibrium of a segment of the cable, you get this beautiful differential equation, which is similar to the equation that we derived for a beam, is it not? So Q here is the load intensity, and it is related to the shape of the cable. If you take the slope of the cable as y dash, then you have a direct relationship between theta and the cable forces. Tan theta is V by H. V can change depending on the location of x, but H is a constant if you have only gravity loads, and that is equal to dy by dx. And so if you substitute this value in the first equation, you get another equation where y of x comes into play. This is a basic differential equation of a cable, and the axial force can be easily generated from that triangle of forces, and you can use these equations to work out what is the profile of a cable for any given distribution in loading. The most common type of distribution in loading is uniformly distributed load, and this can be done in two ways. One is uniformly distributed along the horizontal span, the other is uniformly distributed along the curved span. When do you encounter these two cases? Well, self weight is uniformly distributed along the curved span, and the shape of that cable is called catenary, from the word catena, which means chain. But this is not that common in practice. In practice we use cables to support structures, to support roofs, to support bridges. Cable suspended bridges are of two types. You have the cable stayed bridges where the cables are straight and they have force, tension. Each cable will have a different force. And you have the classic suspension bridges. What is the shape of the cable in suspension bridges? It is parabolic. Why is it parabolic?
Because of uniform loading.
Right. It is parabolic with the idea that the parabola is the ideal shape, the funicular shape, when you have a uniformly distributed load. So you need to ensure that it will remain a parabola even when vehicles move on the bridge. How do you do that? You have to make the deck stiff. So these are the equations. The relationship is very simple. If the sag in the cable is H in the middle, then the horizontal tension in the cable is nothing but the bending moment, which is Q naught L squared by 8 divided by H. So it is a very simple formula, and you can work out the rest of the equation very simply. So here is an example of one of the most famous suspension bridges. 1937, way back, this bridge was designed, analyzed by using simple manual calculations, the kind of formulas that we saw in the previous slide, but today's engineers and today's students would rather use a computer to solve this problem. But at least for a first order analysis, I think it is important to know these simple calculations for a parabola. So here is an example of a cable suspended bridge. The girder that you saw in the previous slide at the bottom is called the stiffening girder. It has to be fairly deep and rigid, because the idea is it should not allow the cable on top to change its shape. All the load that goes on the deck is actually transmitted to the parabolic cable through those vertical elements called suspenders, and if the cable is parabolic, then you can safely assume the suspenders carry a uniformly distributed load, and this can be facilitated by providing a hinge at the center as shown here, because if you provide a hinge at the center and you make this assumption of uniformly distributed load, this problem becomes statically determinate, otherwise it is indeterminate. If it is indeterminate, then actually the force in every cable can also be different. That is a real problem, but this is a simplification. So if you isolate the cable, you will find that there is only one unknown, the uniformly distributed load Q naught. If you know Q naught, then you know the rest of the problem. So how do you solve for Q naught? Well, if you take a free body of that stiffening girder and you analyze it, you take moments about one of the ends, you can find a relationship between the vertical reaction and Q naught. Next, you take that beam apart and you invoke the equation of condition that at the hinge there is no moment transfer, MC is equal to 0, and then you will find that you can solve this equation and get another relationship from which you can establish the value of Q naught. Once you know Q naught, both systems can be separated out, the cable is easy to analyze and design. In the olden days, the real worry was what is the size of the cable to be used, the wire rope. So you need to have an idea of what is the maximum tension in the cable. So it is very simple, find the total load that can come on the bridge, half the load will go to one end on the cable, that is you need the value of Q naught. Q naught into L by 2 is the vertical reaction, and H is Q naught L squared by 8H. The resultant of that is the actual force. If you know the allowable stress in that cable, you can work out backwards what is the diameter you need, you apply some factor of safety. That is how it used to be done. It is a simple straightforward calculation. Now in this problem you can work this out, you can get the results, and once you separate out the stiffening girder, then you can work out, it is statically determinate. If you cut any section, you can work out the shear force and bending moment diagrams. Here is a picture of something we did I think in 2004 or so. Your senior students built this bridge made entirely of newspaper and rope. So it is a cable stayed structure where they use these simple analytical tools to do it. You will find that the two vertical pylons are made up of newspaper. A lot of testing was done in our laboratory, and those ropes are manila rope, and they wanted to put this up in the Guinness Book of World Records. I do not think they succeeded, but it did come out as a journal paper in the AAC Journal for Professional Issues in Engineering Education and Practice. Anita Rao was the student, civil engineering student, who led the team of about 100 other students, and you can look up this article to see the history of how this was done. Funicular arches are ideal arches, and if you have concentrated load, they have to be made up of straight lines. Sometimes they are called linear arches, and they take this shape, okay, and they are very easy to derive. Now you can find the horizontal thrust by simply taking the bending moment at any point and dividing by the height at that point. Okay, so these are called linear arches. This is the parabolic arch. Where do you encounter these arches? In bridges, yes, in bowstring girder bridges, but you can also encounter them in buildings, and I will show you a picture where we did this. Okay, in entrances. Now this is a two-hinged arch which is funicular. The boundary conditions are not important, so you can have if you have a uniformly distributed load along the horizontal span, the parabola is the ideal shape. If you have a curved, if you have a self weight kind of loading, then the catenary arch is the ideal shape. You can build vaults with this shape, and traditionally this used to be done. Here is some work we did many years ago where we built these catenary shaped vaulted structures made up of coconut shells, which can take a lot of compressive load. The entire structure is made up of coconut shells with plaster and with a catenary shaped formwork inside, which can be dismantled and reused. This is a favorite quiz question. You see in this picture 3 bridges, iron arch bridges built during 1850 to the 1900s over the Harlem River at New York. What is so special about these 3 bridges?
So all of them,
They refer to 3 stages of 3 historical advents in the history of structural analysis. What's so special about them? Yeah, the first is a 3-hinged arch. You can barely see that hinge in the middle. The 3-hinged arch is a statically determinate structure, and as we discussed earlier, people were afraid of building indeterminate structures, and they got bolder and they went for the 2-hinged arch and later the fixed arch. Okay, we will study this in the next module, how to analyze indeterminate arches. Here are some useful principles. I think I have asked you this question earlier, but here it goes again. Take a simply supported beam. Let us say half the beam is loaded and the deflection at the midspan is delta 1. Let us say the full beam is loaded, the deflection is delta in that beam. Can we say that, and you can get a formula for delta if you wish, can we say that the midspan deflection delta 1 is half of delta? Yes or no?
Yes. Yes.
But if you remember last year when I asked you this question, all of you said no, right? So why do we say yes? Because of parity. Now to understand parity, you take another beam with the other half loaded and you apply the principle of superposition. You will find that the sum delta 1 plus delta 2 must be equal to delta, but you can argue that delta 1 and delta 2 are the same, because let us say we do an experiment and we load this half of the beam and we measure the deflection at the midspan. What you would draw is one in which the right half is loaded. The picture that I will draw is the one with the left half is being loaded, but we are actually dealing with the same beam, and this is not symmetry, this is called parity, and this is called the principle of parity. It all depends on how you look at the beam, and the deflection is exactly the same. So if you invoke the principles of parity and superposition, you can prove that delta 1 plus delta 2 equal to delta, and delta 1 is equal to delta 2, and so it follows that delta 1 is delta by 2. This combination of parity and superposition we can invoke in many cases. For example, in this 2-hinged arch subjected to a distributed load on one half. Is this a funicular arch? No, because the bending moment diagram for this is not parabola, but still can you say it is determinate, statically determinate? What is the horizontal reaction? The vertical reactions are known. Okay. What is the horizontal reaction? Yes, tell me. Release the support. Then how? Tell me the basis of how to find? What should we do?
Cut the arch into.
No, don't cut the arch.
Put
Yeah,
the
you
other
load the other half. The question is, we don't know h. You load the other half, and when you add these two, you end up with a funicular arch, right? Whose horizontal reaction is known? What is the value? It's q naught L squared by 8h. And how do you get the horizontal thrust in any one of these arches? It will be equal to half that value. So that's it. So when you put them all together, you get 2h, and you can easily work this out. If you go one step further, once you know h, it is statically determinate. You can draw the bending moment diagram and shear force diagram for this structure, and it will. You will find that the bending moment at the crown is 0. Why will it be 0? No, not. Why will the crown moment be 0?
Why will it be 0?
Yes. So it's like a 3-hinged arch, because if the moment there is 0, it's like you got a hinge at that crown. Why will it be 0?
One side it is.
whatever is
One
coming is
side it
being
is hogging,
transferred.
one side it is sagging, sir. If you look from the other side,
Right.
it's like.
So that's right. If it's not 0, it should be either sagging or hogging, in which case in the total arch it should be 2 times that moment, because you're adding, you're doing superposition, but then you won't be able to satisfy the relationship. So the only answer is it has to be 0, and you can actually draw the bending moment diagram. Can you explain why the bending moments in the left half of the arch will be sagging and those in the right half will be hogging? Any sound argument? Yes?
Balance the moment.
Sir, if we take it individually, suppose if we consider the loads in the left side,
Right.
then it would be sagging. At the same time, if we consider the right side, it would be sagging. This is not possible at the same time. So
No, that's right. That's the reason why the moment at the crown is 0. Why is the left half sagging and the right half hogging?
Because it's on the left half where the loads are applied.
Huh?
Because it's on the left half where the loads are applied.
No, that's, I mean, intuitively you're right, but that's not good enough.
If we get the bending moment superimposing.
Do you remember Eddy's theorem?
Yes, sir, this is
So you have to invoke Eddy's theorem. We'll look at that soon. Let's say you have a load, concentrated load acting on a 3-hinge arch like this. This is certainly not a funicular arch. Which would be a funicular arch? This would be a funicular arch, right? So you superimpose both of them with the same height at the crown, and you will find that that deviation from the funicular arch is actually a measure of your bending moment. So that's what you have to do. So if you go back to the previous case, you will find that the bending moment diagram would be as indicated there in the funicular arch. You gave more height than required for the funicular arch in the left half. So if you take the equation m naught minus hy is more than m naught, so you get hogging. On the other side you gave less y than required, so it's sagging. Simple argument. Okay, so let's move ahead. The other thing you need to know is you will also get shear forces and axial forces, and you can actually resolve the vertical force and the horizontal compression, horizontal thrust into axial and shear forces using the geometry of the arch. You have studied all this, and these are simple examples that can be solved, and these type of arches are often either segmental, which means part of a circle, or for which you can derive the equations, or they are parabolic. We don't have time right now to solve a full example, but you've studied this and it's pretty easy to solve, and you can also invoke Eddy's theorem to draw a shape of the diagram. You can write the expressions for bending moment and shear force. they will look like this, and you can also calculate the axial force and the shear force once you have axial force and the axial force based on the shear force, based on the V and H, that is the vertical force and the horizontal thrust. So you will find that there is not too much difference between the segmental arch and the parabolic arch, because the shapes are more or less the same. And for this reason you can even idealize a catenary arch as a parabolic arch, which is easier to handle. We come to the end of this topic. This is a frame suspended by its own weight. So you it's an interesting question, can you draw the bending moment diagram for this frame? So what you need to do is to see how it will look if you were to hang that frame. You will find that the vertical line from A must pass through the center of gravity. You need to locate the center of gravity, and then you can draw the free bodies of these ends. So typically frames are like this. In a cantilever frame, it's wise to start from the free end of the cantilever, and your bending moment diagram will look like this, and a rough shape of the deflected shape will look like this. So intuitively this must appeal to you, and you must also note that this diagram is drawn on the tension side. So the curvature must give you the feeling of tension on the right side. Some concluding points. Okay, this is a favorite question which I can assure you 1 in 1000 engineers answer correctly, but since you have studied this, you will probably give me the right answer. Can you draw the bending moment diagram? So most people will draw this. This is right or wrong? It is wrong. Why is it wrong?
Because the vertical components, there is no bending moment.
Yeah, so there cannot be bending moments in the vertical components, that is the columns. Why not? Very much.
Sir, only axial loads are there.
No. Why only axial load?
Sir, because only vertical reactions are there and
no horizontal reaction. You see, you can't have a horizontal reaction at the supports in a simply supported beam subject to only vertical loading. So if the horizontal reaction is not there, you can't get a bending moment in that vertical element. So this is wrong. So that structure will behave just like a simply supported beam, and the bending moment diagram is just like a simply supported beam. Those two vertical elements are like some legs, some props holding it up together. What about the deflected shape? And that's a challenge, that's a real challenge to draw. You will find that many people draw the diagram like this, which is not correct. Why is it not correct? Right, because the vertical elements are seen to be bending here, but there is no bending moment. So what should you do? Well, you first reproduce this simply supported beam drawing there. Why should you reproduce it? Because the curvatures are the same, the bending moment diagram is the same. Then what should you do for the vertical elements? Yeah, you preserve that. So this is wrong, because this would be violating the 90 degrees. So you have to draw like this, which is still feasible because the roller support allows a movement. So if your original shape was this, so a student who can answer this completely is a rare student. Okay, now we drew this picture earlier. You will find that this bending moment diagram is correct if there was no roller support, if both were hinged, then that picture is correct. And then how to find the reaction can be done from superposition. So take the first case where it is roller, that is a primary structure, it will move to the right. So you need to apply that much force horizontally to eliminate that, and that's how this can be proved. One last picture, the last topic. Is this structure statically determinate or indeterminate? This is a frame. It is indeterminate because you have 4 unknown reactions. So how do you say it is determinate?
By parity.
We separate this into 2 diagrams.
Which diagram?
Sir, in one diagram P by 2 and P by 2 forces.
Very good, very good. Okay, so I will help you there. First of all, the vertical reactions are statically determinate, but the horizontal reactions are not. So as you rightly say, you divide this frame is symmetric, that is the reason why it is going to be determinate. So you divide into two loading diagrams, one is a symmetric loading where you have p by 2 and you have an asymmetric or antisymmetric loading where the p by 2 act in the opposite direction. And in the first diagram, if you assume axial deformations are negligible, what is the deflected shape? There is no deflected shape, it will remain as it is because there is no change in shape, you have only an axial force. Whereas in the second one, if you invoke parity and superposition, you will find that you will have to have p by 2, and so the deflected shape will look like that, and the deflection comes from the antisymmetric loading part. And so once you say p is shared equally p by 2, the indeterminacy is gone, and you can analyze this and you can draw the bending moment diagram. Okay, thank you.